Hey everyone, today we're diving into the book of Genesis, the very first book in both the Jewish Torah and the Christian Old Testament. Now, you might wonder why it's called Genesis. The name actually comes from the Hebrew word bereshit, meaning in the beginning, which was later translated into Greek as Genesis or origin. Pretty fitting for a book that's all about beginnings, right? Now, Genesis isn't just a story. It's the start of everything in these sacred texts, the first of 5 foundational books known as the Pentateuch or the Torah, often called the teachings or the laws of Moses. But what's fascinating is that scholars believe it wasn't necessarily written by one person. Many traditions say Moses wrote it, but theories suggest it may actually come from different sources woven together over centuries. This brings us to what's known as the documentary hypothesis. Genesis has this unique mix of myths, hymns, prayers, and even old folk tales. So why are some stories told in slightly different ways? Why are there different names for God, like Lord and God Almighty? Well, in the 19th century, researchers started seeing these differences as clues about how the text was built. They proposed that multiple sources or voices contributed to the book's formation, each reflecting different historical contexts and regions. For instance, we have something called the J source, where God is portrayed in a way that feels more human, with phrases like the hand of God or the face of God. This source likely comes from Jerusalem and uses Yahweh as the name of God, which later got translated to Jehovah. Then there's the E source, named for the word Elohim, which paints a more abstract picture of God, a being who speaks through angels rather than showing up in person. And we also have the P source, or the priestly source, which focuses on rituals, genealogies, and the sacred traditions passed down through generations. The last main source, called the D source, or Deuteronomist, is thought to come from the period when Jewish communities were trying to bring together all their traditions into one text, especially after events like the invasion of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians and the later Babylonian exile. What's even more intriguing is how Genesis seems to honor different oral traditions, preserving them even when they sometimes overlap or contradict each other. Scholars think the stories in Genesis might have originated between 1800 and 1400 BCE, reflecting life in the Middle East and Egypt during the Late Bronze Age. And while it's a book of origins, it might actually be one of the last books to reach its final form. And the first chapters of Genesis aren't just about the start of the world. They explore what it means to be human and where we come from. Unlike other ancient creation myths, like the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, where gods are chaotic and humans are created just to serve them, Genesis portrays creation as something good. Here, God speaks the world into existence, making humanity in His own image and giving us responsibility over all other life on earth. When God says, "Let us make humans in our image," it sparks questions. Who is us here? Scholars think it might refer to God speaking to a heavenly court, possibly angels, or it could even be the royal we, a phrase used to show authority. And that line about being made in God's image, does that mean we look like God, or is it more about reflecting God's ability to govern? Some say it's about humans being entrusted to rule over the earth, much like God oversees the universe. And now let's dive deeper into Genesis with the story of Adam and Eve. In Genesis 2, we see a different creation story. Here, God creates Adam first, then forms Eve from one of Adam's ribs. They're placed in the paradise-like Garden of Eden with access to everything, except one thing. God tells them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, ancient religions often had a fall story explaining why humans suffer and die. In this story, a serpent tempts Eve, who then shares the forbidden fruit with Adam. From here, things spiral. The fall introduces human choice, as Adam and Eve freely choose to disobey. But this story goes deeper. People sometimes wonder, if God is all-knowing, why didn't He stop Adam and Eve? The answer isn't directly given in Genesis, but interpretations in Jewish and Christian thought say that God wanted humans to have free will. He didn't want mindless followers. And because of this choice, Adam and Eve's punishment reflects the hard realities of life. Men would have to labor for survival, and women would experience pain in childbirth. The ultimate consequence, mortality. Genesis never mentions original sin from sexual acts. That idea actually came centuries later, in the 4th century, from St. Augustine. The next few chapters of Genesis are packed with foundation stories. For instance, God eventually regrets creating humanity because of the evil on earth. So, what does he do? He sends a massive flood. This isn't a unique story. Many cultures have a flood myth. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods send a flood because humans were too noisy. But in Genesis, God saves Noah and his family by instructing them to build an ark, essentially preserving life and giving humanity a fresh start. After the flood, Noah's descendants repopulate the earth, leading to a list of nations and genealogies. Another interesting story is the Tower of Babel. Humans, wanting to build a tower that reaches the heavens, push too far. God intervenes, scattering them across the world and giving them different languages to prevent such cooperation from happening again. And here's where the big shift happens in Genesis, starting with Abraham in chapter 12. God reaches out to him, asking him to move his family to Canaan. He promises Abraham something incredible. His descendants will become a great nation. And that's exactly what the name Abraham signifies, a father of nations. God establishes a covenant or sacred agreement with him. This covenant basically says, you be loyal to me, and I'll protect and bless your family. The only problem, Abraham and his wife Sarah are both old, and Sarah is unable to have children. The rest of Genesis explores how God will fulfill his promise of countless descendants despite this challenge. And it's not just Sarah. Throughout Genesis, women who seem unable to have children later conceive through what's described as divine intervention. Often they receive a message, an annunciation, either from God or an angel, announcing that they will bear a son who will play a crucial role in God's plan. Sarah even goes as far as to tell Abraham to have a child with her Egyptian slave, Hagar, as a sort of surrogate arrangement. In those days, slaves were considered property, so this wasn't seen as adultery. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, who is also promised a future as the ancestor of a great nation, which is traditionally seen as the Arabs. Then, as a sign of this covenant with Abraham, God introduces the ritual of circumcision, a permanent marker of belonging to this chosen people. Though many ancient cultures practiced circumcision, it wasn't about hygiene. It was a symbolic, tribal act marking identity and loyalty. Next up is one of the most famous and debated stories in Genesis, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. 3 angels visit Abraham and warn him that these cities will be destroyed because of their grave sin. Abraham's nephew Lot lives in Sodom, so he welcomes the angels into his home. But things take a dark turn when the men of Sodom surround the house, demanding to know the visitors. The word know here is likely a euphemism for sexual relations, but it's unclear if their sin is meant to be sexual violence or a violation of hospitality, which was sacred in ancient times. Either way, the cities are ultimately destroyed with fire and brimstone. This story, especially in Christian discussions, has often been used to argue moral points about sexuality, but it's worth noting that ancient Judaism also condemned any act seen as opposing the command to be fruitful and multiply. Whatever the exact nature of their wrongdoing, Sodom and Gomorrah face utter destruction, and Lot and his daughters flee to safety, continuing the family line. And Genesis takes an intense turn with the story of Abraham and Isaac. Sarah finally gives birth to Isaac, fulfilling God's promise to Abraham of a son. But then something unimaginable happens. God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It's one of the most debated moments in the Bible, and interpretations vary. Was it God's way of setting a boundary, rejecting human sacrifice, which was common in some ancient cultures? Or was it to underscore that while first fruits were meant for God, this didn't extend to one's children? Either way, this story stands as a test of Abraham's faith and obedience. At the last moment, an angel intervenes, sparing Isaac. From here, Genesis shifts to follow Isaac's descendants. Isaac's son, Jacob, plays a big role, especially after his intense, mysterious wrestling match with God, which results in him receiving a new name, Israel, meaning he who prevails. Jacob's story unfolds with his 12 sons, born to his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and their maidservants. These 12 sons become the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. The complicated family dynamics here, involving sons from wives and slaves, likely reflect how the tribes later settled in Canaan, with some regions favored over others based on lineage and birth order. Interestingly, Jacob's firstborn sons don't end up inheriting his legacy, as might be expected. The honor eventually passes to his 4th son, Judah, a point that gives historical support to the claim of kingship for King David, who came from Judah's line. Later in Genesis, we learn of the death of Sarah. Abraham purchases a burial plot in the cave of Machpelah, paying a significant amount, 400 shekels of silver, to make sure it's officially his. This purchase not only provides a resting place for Sarah, but also marks a symbolic claim on the land, which is still remembered as a significant early settlement for the Jewish people. Other patriarchs are also buried there, and today, Machpelah remains a shrine significant to both Jewish and Muslim communities. The final major narrative in Genesis follows Jacob's son, Joseph, and his journey to Egypt. As one of Jacob's favorites, Joseph's story is filled with sibling rivalry and prophetic dreams. Joseph's dreams, in which his brothers bow to him, fuel their jealousy, leading them to sell him into slavery. But Joseph's fortunes turn in Egypt, where his gift for interpreting dreams earns him a powerful role as vizier, or prime minister. When famine hits Canaan, Joseph's brothers unknowingly come to him for help. After some hidden tests and drama, he finally reveals his identity, forgiving them and inviting the whole family to Egypt. By the end of Genesis, the descendants of Abraham are settled and thriving in Egypt, with a promise that God will one day lead them back to the land promised to their ancestors. Joseph, on his deathbed, hints at what's to come. God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is where Genesis closes, setting the stage for the next chapter in their journey, detailed in Exodus. Here, we see how Genesis serves as a foundation, capturing the roots of a people, a culture, and a faith that, through struggles, divine interventions, and unwavering hope, keeps circling back to God's original promises.